Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our roundtable on European populism. This is an event organized in cooperation with SPOW25 and the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, which is an interdisciplinary research center at the University of Amsterdam. My name is Maria Weimer. I'm a scholar of European law here at the Amsterdam Law School, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I'd like to say just a couple of words about why we decided to organize this event. On the one hand, the importance of discussing European populism should be evident to everyone today. There's no shortage in news and reports about the rise of populism in Europe. On the other hand, if you look closer, there are many open questions about this phenomenon. There seem to be different kinds of populism. There is a discussion and often disagreement about what drives populism, how strong the electoral successes really are. So there's many open questions, and in the last year we also see a mixed picture of electoral wins. So on the one hand, populist parties on the right have won elections, most notably here in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders' PVV. But they have also lost national elections, such as the election in Poland. So this is also a mixed picture. And now we are in 2024, and this year might present us with a new situation. There might be a new tipping point for European populism, with several key national parliamentary elections coming up tomorrow, I think, in Croatia, but also in Austria and Bulgaria, for example. And of course, with the looming European Parliament elections in June. So these, the outcomes of these elections could profoundly influence the political landscape in Europe, and they could have significant implications for several crucial policy areas, above all immigration, climate change, social protection, but also geopolitics. Our discussion today will explore what European populism is, how it affects the process of European integration, and the broader implications it holds for democracy in Europe. And we are very fortunate to have three highly knowledgeable speakers with us who can help us unpack the complexities of populism and its current moment. So let me briefly introduce the speakers today. First of all, we have Sarah de Lange. Sarah is Professor of Political Pluralism at the Department of Political Science. All of our speakers are from the University of Amsterdam, the UvA. Sarah's main research interests concern parties, party families, and party systems. Her work is broad in geographical scope and examines party politics in a range of East and Western European countries. Sarah de Lange is currently working on a project funded by the Dutch scientific organization NVO, which is titled Generational Differences in Determinants of Party Choice. The project examines how the mechanisms that explain voting behavior differ between younger and older generations. We also have Robin de Bruin with us, who is a senior lecturer at the European Studies Department of the UvA, where he works on the political history of European integration. Robin studies Dutch perceptions of Europe and the effects thereof on the national political system in the Netherlands. His research explores the connection, or his more recent research explores the connection between decolonization and European integration. And he is currently conducting a project which is titled Colonial Exceptionalism or Co-Imperialism, Imperial Powers and European Unity. And there he examines the political imagination from the 1920s to the 1970s about the future course of imperial relationships. How fascinating. Last but not least, we have Brian Burgoon with us. Brian is Professor of Political Economy in the Department of Political Science. And Brian's research focuses on global economic integration, welfare state development, and democratic political representation. The key goal of his research is to understand how the politics of these realms influence each other, and how economic interdependence, social protection, and democracy can be rendered compatible or even mutually reinforcing. In his recent book with Peter Trubowitz, titled Geopolitics and Democracy, Brian offers a powerful new explanation for the rise of anti-globalism in the West and how the decline of the West's political embrace of liberal internationalism reflects a neglect of social protection for its losers. Welcome to the discussion. It is a pleasure to have you. So let us go right into the topic. Sarah, I will start with you and ask you to say a couple of words about maybe the very notion of populism. Who are the populist party? How should we understand this notion? Who belongs, who doesn't belong to that category?
Yeah, so it's very interesting that this evening is about European populism. But if we are looking at current debates about what's going to happen in European Parliament elections, then most of the coverage is actually about a very particular form of populism, namely the populist radical right. So populism is a very broad category of ideology. It's a way of thinking about politics and society as consisting of, ordinary citizens that have inherently good qualities and that are not being properly represented by a corrupt elite that is inherently bad. So it's a moral opposition between a good people and a bad elite. And that is an idea that we see with parties both on the left, on the right, even in the center. And some of these parties have been successful for a very long time, already since the 1980s. And most of these parties have been slowly growing in the past 4 decades. But that is the case more so for the populist radical right than for the populist radical left, because the latter was especially electorally successful at the time of the financial economic crisis, the Euro crisis. But since then, many populist radical left parties have declined in support. So if we think of the most well-known example, it would be Syriza from Greece, a party that was, winning elections at that time, that led the government, but that has now practically disappeared from the political scene. Other populist radical left parties are also not faring so well in Europe. I think the SP here in the Netherlands, or Die Linke in Germany. There are a few exceptions. If we look at Belgium, which will have not only European elections, but also national elections in June, the populist radical left there is actually doing fairly well. They're third in the polls. But those are exceptions to a more general rule. The success of the populist radical right has been far more consistent over time and also far more substantial. So if we look at the populist radical right currently in Europe, then we see that a number of these parties are actually in the polls ranking first. So their electoral success is projected to be above 25%, sometimes even getting close to 30%. This isn't the case, for example, in Austria for the FPÖ. It's the case in Belgium for the Vlaams Belang. It's the case in France for the Rassemblement National. And it's also very much the case for the PVV here in the Netherlands. And then following that are a number of populist radical right parties that are not first but second, but still polling around 20% of the vote currently. So that would be the AfD in Germany, for example, or the Sweden Democrats. That is not to say that every populist radical right party in Europe is doing well at the moment. There are countries where the populist radical right has really collapsed in recent years. Think of Denmark, for example, which was really once considered as sort of a leading case of showcasing the influence of the populist radical right, especially on immigration policy. But there, the populist radical right has collapsed due to internal strife. So if we look at populism as a broader concept, we see quite a mixed picture. But if we zoom in on the populist radical right, then we see that that is really a thriving party family in most West European countries. And the success that they have in national polls translates more or less directly into their expected success in polls for the European Parliament. So also there we are seeing figures between 20 and 25% or even 25 and 30% in most cases. Now, whether that will actually materialize on election day is a whole different question. So a lot of the media coverage at the moment is really creating this narrative that this will be the elections of the populist radical right. Now, this narrative was present in the media in 2019. It was present in the media in 2014. And each time it didn't really materialize, not at least to the extent that the media anticipated. And this has a lot to do with the fact that turnout in European Parliament elections is relatively low in most European countries. And it's very difficult to predict what kinds of voters will be motivated to go and vote in the elections. And that is something that especially hampers populist radical right parties, because they have voters that are more distrustful of politics, more dissatisfied, have also lower levels of education on average, are more Eurosceptic, and that might suppress turnout for this particular group of voters. Depending on how the campaign evolves, it could also be a mobilizing factor, right? If these elections are really going to be about the future of the EU, then it might actually also motivate some of these voters to go out and cast a ballot.
So it's not just the media, but also think tanks. The European Council for Foreign Relations has published an analysis where they predict a sharp right turn in the EP elections. And they predict that the majority of the EP seats, of the European Parliament seats, will be center-right, but also
so if you look
right
at these
populist
kinds of projections, which do not only look at the polls that are being published, but weight them on the basis of turnout and weight them on other kinds of factors that are important to predict outcomes of European elections, then the populist radical right jointly is projected to get about a quarter of the MEPs in the European Parliament. And that would make them, as a group, as a party family, the second force in the European Parliament. But this should be nuanced, because currently these parties don't really work together as one group. First of all, they're divided over two different parliamentary groups, the ECR and the ID, with some successful parties like the PIS in Poland or Vox in Spain being in the first, and other successful parties like the PVV in the Netherlands or the Rassemblement National being in the second. But even within these groups, they have an agreement that because they're nationalist parties, as populist radical right parties, that national interest prevails. So very often these parties don't cooperate on a practical level, and especially they don't vote together on issues, right? There's no whipping taking place in the same way that it happens in other parliamentary groups in the European Parliament. So that number of a quarter of MEPs in itself, it doesn't say that much about what will change in the dynamics of the European Parliament.
This is actually a nice transition to you, Robin, because you just mentioned this idea that in the European Parliament, this kind of far-right populist parties, they don't necessarily work together. They don't have issue coalitions or maybe pragmatic sort of political cooperation. But then the question is, and that is for you, Robin, what is the image of the European Union that the far-right populist parties entertain. So is there something that unites them around the idea of Europe? Oh yes, sure. As you prefer.
Get all kind of important details. So yes, well, the image of the European Union and European integration history in different populist parties, I think differs a little bit. But there are certain specific elements that are repeated time and again, such as the fact that the EU is a project of corrupt elites. And, well, there's one specific element in Dutch populism that really puzzles me, and this is the remarkable selection of friends and foes in European integration history by Dutch populist parties such as Geert Wilders' PVV or Thierry Baudet's Forum for Democracy. The anti-EU propaganda of populist parties often refers to the theory that the European Union and the predecessors of the European Union, such as the European Coal and Steel Community and the European Economic Community, were and are instruments in the hands of sinister elites who would try to flood the internal market with cheap labor. And references to this alleged plan can be found in parliamentary debates in the Netherlands, especially in contributions by, for example, Martin Bosma of the PVV, or members of the members of Parliament of the Forum for Democracy, FVD. For example, the PVV's 2021 program for the national parliamentary elections stated that the EU cannot and does not want to monitor Europe's external borders. The PVV sees the EU as a replacist power that strives for the omvolking, change in the composition of the population of the predominantly white population of Europe with migrants from Africa and the Middle East. So according to the PVV and according to Forum for Democracy, members of today's political elites in Europe are encouraging and welcoming an invasion of refugees and migrants from Africa and the Middle East in order to cause this demographic decline of the native European population. And I think that this is the most important thing that connects these two parties, but also the other parties in Europe. And now I wanted to say something about the connection they make with the ideas about European integration from the 1920s that were developed by the Austro-Japanese Count Coudenhove-Kalergi. He invented an idea, a plan for European integration, Europe and its colonies, its overseas colonies, Pan-Europa it was called, and this man was a conservative, this man was a Catholic, this man flirted with Mussolini and with fascism. He was a corporatist, he wasn't a real Democrat, he was more a supporter of corporatism as a political system. And this man and his ideas, the Kalergi plan, well, many people from these populist far-right, alt-right parties see him as the founding father of this idea, of this plan for a white genocide. And this is what fascinates me. This is what I think is really very interesting because, well, in fact, it was a kindred spirit to today's populist parties in his views about European superiority, about the European right to rule other parts of the world. And this is what I really find very fascinating. And also, the opposite is happening. The PVV sees Willem Drees, one of the most important prime ministers in the Netherlands in the 20th century, as a kindred spirit. Well, Willem Drees was a socialist. a social democrat, and he was responsible as a prime minister for the participation of the Netherlands in the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Atomic Energy Community, the European Economic Community, and still he is regarded by members of the PVV as some sort of a Eurosceptic, which he wasn't, by the way. This is what really fascinates me. On the one hand, they tend to regard people like Willem Drees, who were responsible for the Dutch participation in the European integration project, as kindred spirits, and on the other hand, the kindred spirits from the past, like Coudenhove-Kalergi, are seen as the founding fathers of this idea of a white genocide. So I think to answer your question very briefly, yes, there are certain elements, and this idea of remplacement, grand remplacement, as it is called in France, so the change of the composition of the population, I think that's one of the crucial elements.
Thank you, Robin.
Sorry, can I ask a question? What's your position? I didn't understand what you were trying to say. Like, what's your position on all this?
Do you want to take this to clarify?
The question was,
Yeah, maybe I can clarify the question.
to what extent are there similarities between the ideas about the European Union in different populist parties? Yeah. And my point was that this idea of a white genocide and this idea about the replacement or partial replacement of the population in Europe is one of the crucial elements.
Mm.
Yeah.
So
you said it's interesting, it's a crucial element. I don't hear your position.
well, so first, yeah. I mean, we will have later on a moment where we open to the audience and we collect questions. So maybe perhaps you could hold back for a moment and then bring it back in the discussion when we take questions from the audience, and then maybe Robin can clarify again.
I don't know about, I just struggle on the point of leaving if I don't understand your position on the white genocide. Are you pro or against?
No. I think Robin was, if I may, Robin, I think that Robin was offering a historical perspective by explaining how populist parties use certain images from the past in a rhetorical way to mobilize ideas against Europe. So it was an attempt to explain how history is used in populist discourse rather than taking positions, right? But let's continue for now, because we still have. Yeah, we can come back to that later. But for now, I also would very much like to hear Brian's take on this topic. And so, Brian, Sarah has already said something about the likelihood or the prospect of electoral wins in the European Parliament election. So my first question to you would be, do you share this analysis that we have to be careful, and that a lot of the fears that the right-wing parties will have major wins in the European Parliament election, that is a bit overblown? Do you share that? And the second question then, if let's assume that those predictions realize, what would be the political implications, both for political, so for politics in Europe, but also for policy in Europe?
Yeah, so thanks. I agree with what Sarah was sketching as the predictions based on our sort of best estimates of what is likely to happen, and I want to clarify that I also agree with the uncertainty that Sarah was emphasizing. So it's hard to predict particularly European elections, but to the extent that we can make judgments and predictions, and we should, I think, as citizens and voters, but also people who want to understand the future of Europe, to the extent that we want to make those judgments, I think the right judgment is that it's looking very likely that there's going to be a significant increase to the right in the balance of representation of the European Parliament. And the kinds of numbers that Sarah was mentioning seem about right. So about a quarter of the seats will be controlled by those parties, and that's a significant increase compared to the status quo ante. And if that's true, then it is also important to recognize that in a European Parliament context, that works differently than in a national context. Sarah already mentioned this a little bit, that there's not whipping that goes on. So if you have 25% of the vote, you can't necessarily get them to agree with each other on substantive votes within the European Parliament. It's also important to recognize that the way the European institutions work, the Parliament doesn't select a government in the way that is true for most democracies within the member states at the national level. So even if there's a significant parliamentary move in a particular direction, it isn't obvious how that would immediately translate into the policy of the Commission or what the European Council would decide and so on, which in the end are really important for the kinds of policy questions. Having said that, the Parliament plays a very important role for appointing the president of the Commission, right? So they do have this sort of voting role, and they play a very important role in capturing the tenor and sentiment of Europeans at the European level as the only European level institution that has a openly democratically elected personnel. Right? That cannot be said about the European Council, which is delegated to national representatives that come from national elections. And that definitely cannot be said of the European Commission, right? So it's very important to see that this increase in power is not obvious what it means. Okay, so having said that, I still believe that what we're likely to get is a rightward shift in the orientation of the European Parliament, and I think therefore also a rightward shift in the position taking with respect to all the issues you can imagine that are important in Europe. So already a couple have been mentioned, so by both Sarah, but particularly by Robin. So if you look at sort of nationalism compared to EU priorities or capacities, or if you look at immigration as part of nationalism versus European level priorities, both of those are connected to a sort of a debate really about how much national borders should be controlled by particular nation states. And I think it's fair to say that the most obvious place where you could expect a shift in policy is going to be on asylum policy at the EU level, how much pressure will be posed by European level institutions on national governments to accept sort of quotas that have been agreed upon in a European context. There might be a more fortress Europe kind of dynamic when it comes to migration and particularly asylum issues. I can imagine that would be an important change. It's important to say, however, that when it comes to like the broader idea of Europe versus national capacities, there really has been a sort of a pretty earth-shattering change in the debate on the radical right if you compare this to what was going on in 2016 around Brexit. And Brexit has definitely changed the tenor of that discussion in a way where even the most sort of hard Eurosceptic parties are not really exit-oriented as much as they are in fundamentally trying to protect the autonomy, the sovereignty of the nation state relative to the prerogatives of the EU. They're not asking for exit. They're asking for, more time, more delegation to a more confederal kind of system, right? Not a federal system where the EU has a lot of agenda-setting power and influence over policies, but where the nation states have that and retain that. So I think that's an important difference, but I do think that nonetheless, a rightward shift does mean less Europe when it comes to these capacities, and we should expect that to be the case. And then let me say that when it comes to a number of, actually virtually every other issue that we study in politics, it's fair to say that the rightward shift can be really meaningful. It can be an important change in what Europe is going to do. So, for instance, the Green Deal, right, this important environmental sort of agenda of the EU, which has been put together by a pretty center-lefty kind of way of thinking about environmental issues in the last 10 years at the EU level, has fallen out of step, I think, with a lot of national-level voters in general, but particularly with the rightward shift in a lot of national sentiments, and definitely out of step with the radical right. And I mean, a lot of research shows what you've already seen in the news, that people are not happy with very aggressive targets that would constitute real pain for national populations. These turn out to be segments of the population who particularly disproportionately vote for these radical right populist parties. And indeed, the signal that those parties are going to be successful electorally is a reminder that a lot of these environmental policies are going to be either have to be rolled back, or you have to really change the way you unfold them and the way you implement them to include much more generous compensation for losers, which has so far been pretty modest in a lot of the proposals that have been put forward. So I actually anticipate that this is going to be a really fundamental change, certainly to the way the Europeans think about what Europe does compared to other geopolitical actors. It's no longer going to be this green leader or net zero by 2050. I find that really on very shaky ground in light of these political shifts. But so that's environmental policy. Social policy, an area that I study a lot. I also think it's important to know that the radical right parties are less interested in almost any kind of social policy initiative at the EU level, even compared to sort of center-right parties. So in my own research, you'll find that in general parties, certainly the right, but also the left, are circumspect or not very excited about taking national level prerogatives on the welfare state and giving it to Europe, right? They're worried that that will undermine their own sort of democratically chosen, hard fought for sort of gains in social policy. But that sentiment is particularly strong on the radical right. It's more chauvinist on the radical right. I want to protect the social policy for the insiders. But even the kinds of social policy initiatives at the EU level that are trying to address exactly these worries, things like creating an insurance policy that ensures that national level policies can be more generous, right? It's really just an insurance provision. It's not actually telling the national governments what they should do with social policy. It's saying, if you get in trouble fiscally, we'll create a fund that will make it easier for you to push the policies that you yourselves want to maintain. Even that kind of involvement by the EU is opposed by the radical right parties in a way that is not true for anywhere else on the political spectrum in these parties. So this is something that people don't know a lot about, but that's going to be a big change for some of the most important shifts in the next generation EU and spending on the SURE program. It's very serious parts of what the EU is doing with its funds. That's likely to be a real shift. And I could go on. I mean, there are a lot of other issues, and the last one I want to mention is geopolitics, which is that the radical right, they have very different ideas. The populist parties have very different ideas about what the geopolitical position of Europe ought to be. Is NATO good or not? Should the EU have its own army and develop its own sort of political presence as a military geopolitical actor? Should they be more or less sort of opposed to Putin or maybe supportive of a Putin agenda? It turns out that the radical right is really divided on those issues, right? Including people who are very pro-Putin and as a sort of a Christian nationalist kind of idea, nationalist blood and belonging kind of idea. But also there are plenty of radical right parties that are very interested in maintaining national sovereignty and the sovereignty of Europe and championing Europe and recognize that after the war in Ukraine, the attack on Ukraine, that has changed the way Europe should deal with Russia and with Putin as a leader of Russia. It's hard to predict exactly what this will mean, but there's no question but that every single one of the radical right parties want there to be less aid to Ukraine. Right? They all, not all of them, plenty of them are in favor of maintaining some kind of support for Ukrainian sort of resistance to this sort of incursion on Ukrainian sovereignty. That's part of a general geopolitical hope that Europe will support, the rule-based international order and so on. But they don't want to spend a lot of money if it means sacrificing a lot of their other national prerogatives. And so I actually would expect that the European election does predict a real shift in the geopolitical stance of Europe on exactly those kinds of geopolitical confrontation issues with Russia. It's going to probably put some brakes on the development of European security and defense policy, though common procurement policies that have been discussed, maybe even more money for a European level pooling of defense capacities. These things are really going to change. So it basically means that every issue that I just mentioned, which are really hot button issues, big issues, immigration, the basic position of government, national versus European, the social policy, the welfare state, healthcare, environmental policy. Basically, all of these policies are going to take, they're going to be actually shifted because of this change. And how much and exactly, how seriously, I don't know, but I think it's fair to predict that this is going to be a rightward shift in the basic constitution of what Europe means for people.
Thank you, Brian. Sarah?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think, the pace at which these changes will come and will not only depend on the European Parliament elections. They will be only one election in a big election calendar for this year and the next. And how fast these changes will go will really depend also on national elections in EU member states, especially in the bigger ones. So there will be Belgian elections already on the same day as the EP elections that will create a massive shift towards the populist radical right in Belgium. But those elections will also be followed fairly soon by elections in countries like Austria, but even more importantly in France and Germany in not too long a period of time. And these elections will have an impact on the way the European Council functions. There will be different representatives there on behalf of the member states. It will not only be Giorgia Meloni on behalf of Italy and Orban on behalf of Hungary, but there will be more populist radical right representatives probably. And that will really reinforce these kinds of developments. So it will be sort of a gradual process where we will see these shifts slowly being started when the EP gets elected, but then picking up pace if more populist radical right parties assume office across Europe.
Yeah, and let me ask you a question about the if. Mm-hmm. So is there also a connection and a sort of a reinforcing connection between how the European Parliament election goes and national elections that follow? So is there also sort of could there be a causal influence, and particularly, let's take the Netherlands? Would that have any impact on coalition building in the Netherlands right now?
So it's very difficult to predict how far the negotiations will be by the time we will get to the EP elections in June. There's still almost 2 months to go. Generally speaking, European Parliament elections are seen as second-order elections, in the sense that because we don't directly elect a parliament that appoints a government, there is less at stake for citizens, and hence the lower turnout. But that also means that different factors impact on how citizens vote in these elections. And one of the things that really plays a role is that they use these EP elections as sort of a device to send signals to national level politicians, and especially to show dissatisfaction with national governments. So in that sense, they're more of a thermometer of what's going on in national politics at the moment than that they impact on national politics. They're more of a reflection of the current state of affairs in countries across the EU.
Okay, thanks a lot. So, okay, so I'd like to ask a different kind of question, and it has to do brings us back to the notion of what is actually populism, what is a populist party. So you spoke about the left and right divide, but there is also a discussion about other kinds of divides that exist, right? So what about geographical divides between northern countries and southern countries? Is there a northern type of populism and a southern type of populism? How do we think about that? And maybe just also then connected to that, could you tell us more about the transnational dimension? So do populist parties, typically we think about them as a national phenomenon, but do they also cooperate internationally? Do they actually create international alliances, and is there some sort of contagion between countries when it comes to populism?
Yeah. Well, if we look at the populist radical right, we can't really speak of a clear north-west divide in terms of ideology, right? These are all parties with a shared ideology, so they're nativist in the sense that they adhere to a xenophobic form of nationalism, they're populist, and they're also authoritarian, right? They're very much rule of law, law and order, I should say, parties. And they share this Euroscepticism that both Robin and Brian described, right? That's no longer exit-oriented, but that does entail a very, very fundamental critique of the EU, because national sovereignty should always prevail over European decision-making. I think in the context of the EU and behavior in the European Parliament, but also in the European Council, I think there is one relevant dimension, and that's a little bit along the north-south divide, and that is whether or not countries are net receivers from the EU or net contributors. Because, of course, the national interest is what's critical. So what we've seen, for example, for Italy, is that Meloni has been very forthcoming in cooperating within the context of the European Council. Why? Because her country actually benefits from the EU, and she really needs the EU given the current state of the Italian economy. But that's different for many of the Northern European populist radical right party that really feel that all they're doing is subsidizing Southern Europe. But that's not a fundamental ideological divide, that's very much a national interest-based divide. It doesn't stop these parties from cooperating together, not in these European parliamentary groups. We see there they work together across the north-south divide, but also across the east-west divide, but also outside of the European Parliament. So a lot of the important progress in cooperation has been made at informal conferences. In the last couple of years, it's been Vox in Spain that has really tried to bring all these different parties together and get them to settle on a shared manifesto around this idea of national sovereignty and national identity. But also this week, we will be seeing a lot of these party leaders going to Hungary for the CPAC, a conference that has come from the US and that's now also organized in Europe, in Hungary. And they will be giving very performative speeches there about, family, fatherland, God. But behind the scenes, there will definitely also be discussions on how to improve cooperation in the European Parliament to be more impactful. At the same time, we also need to realize that so far, the way that populist radical right parties have operated in the European Parliament is somewhat different than from other types of parties. So other types of parties have been very much engaged in the legislative process, right? In committee work, in writing reports, etc. Populist radical right parties, not so much. They've really used the European Parliament really as sort of a platform where they can articulate their ideas and bring them to the attention of European media and the European public. So it's far more sort of a stage for them to showcase their nationally oriented ideas than a place to directly engage with legislation, which is, of course, it makes perfect sense because they don't want a lot of European legislation. Yeah. So
maybe that's their impact, right? That they actually can block.
Well, that will be, so one of the key elements, and Brian is absolutely right about this, there will be changes in some policy areas. And a lot of these changes will come from the fact that these populist radical right parties, together with the Christian Democrats and Conservatives in the European People's Party, will have the power to block all kinds of initiatives. So it will really sort of be a stalling process of all kinds of initiatives that have already been taken, but that will be stopped or that will be delayed.
do you want to? Do you have questions to each other, perhaps, before we open for questions from the audience?
Well, first I want to say something about, so it's not so much a disagreement as it is a possible wrinkle to the pattern that we're seeing now compared to the past. So when Sarah mentioned that there's this performative quality to the politics of these parties at the European level, I think that has definitely been true up until now. Right? It's hard to imagine a single example where there was real committee work or sort of the grunt work of agenda setting or commission work to do something, even if it's in a nationalist direction, to do something as part of the framing of actual European policy. But I guess my hunch is that something is changing in Europe, that the attempts to try to come up with a common platform that Vox spearheaded and some of the other discussions that have taken place in various informal networks have actually thickened and not thinned if you look at the last 5 to 10 years. And I actually believe that there's enough common ground across these parties, and it's kind of sort of obvious that there's enough common ground on the issues that I was mentioning and many others, that I can imagine that there is going to be room for a much more substantive sort of populist radical right organization at the European level that would champion a very particular kind of policy. I expect that particularly on immigration issues, I could imagine that being the case. When it comes to a number of environmental issues, I can imagine that being the case. So I think it's conceivable that will change, right? I don't want to be the person who's always predicting a very strong sort of fundamental change, but I actually think we shouldn't discount that possibility.
Well, I had a question for you. You talked about different issues, different policy fields. Do you expect a change in the position of the different institutions, and do you expect institutional change in the long term?
And by that you mean the European Council, the European Parliament, European Commission? I mean, as a general matter, I don't expect fundamental change, just because that takes so much more organization than we see happening. And it's not like the rightward shift of parties or the programs of the parties that are going to be responsible for this or manifest this rightward shift. It's not like those parties have a big agenda on this topic, right? To the extent that they want to say something, it is a sort of classic populist story that these are not elected officials, and this is an institution of elites who are out of touch, and so on. And so you would think that would make them particularly fond of the European Parliament as the electoral institution that could be strengthened. But it's not like they have come up with proposals to strengthen that institution relative to the others, to my knowledge at least. So I wouldn't expect that there would be a big change in the balance of power between these institutions. And in fact, that is what is likely to create very strong pressure towards inertia, even if the tide changes in the way I was describing. It's important to realize that the expectations are that the EPP, so the European People's Party, which is a sort of center-right agglomeration, that's likely still to be the best, the biggest or the second biggest party, and they're likely to still be able to control a lot of the posts, working implicitly together with the Social Democrats, so working across the left-right divide. These have been the powerhouses that have been responsible for the appointment of commission leaders, a lot of characteristics to key European policies and what European institutions do. I suspect that they will still have that influence. The thing is that it's possible that the Parliament will become more, in a sense, more active and activist in these politics. But it's not going to come from a specific institutional agenda of the radical right populist parties. So I don't expect a significant shift that way.
So, shall we see if we have questions from the audience? Yeah, the gentleman in the front row. Shall I pass on the mic? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm an entrepreneur myself and work in the climate field for the building environment. If you talk about climate, you mentioned the Green Deal, action, and have results. That's also my daily job. And if I watch to the national government here, I see no any action at all last 10 years. It is already conservative, we do nothing until it's something broke or going wrong. And then we act. On European level, completely other world. Active, directives, acts, directives, green deals. And the speed and the amount of was impressive. If somebody can step down with opgeheven hoofd, I don't know the English word, but
Head held high.
yeah, it's a European Commission. But if you see just on the acts and they do the last 3-4 years. But another example in my field is we need people. So we need people to realize the goals. On European level, there's also we need people from outside if we have not our own people here, because there's a big group of people getting retired coming years. And if you see this and you have the goals on European level, and we commit as a country to these goals, then we need all the people, our own people, but also people from abroad if we not have enough. How can we match this with populism idea that we have only our own country and we will solve everything by ourselves? I don't understand.
So I'll take the first crack at this issue, and now you'll also the question we had earlier about where do we stand on this. I can answer that for myself on this particular issue. So I mean, all of us are here to speak as social scientists and historians and people who are commentators about what's going on, where we're doing our best to understand what's going on. Where our own position on what would be good and bad is we're doing our best to try and keep that out of our position taking, right? I'll speak for myself when I say that, but I think it's fair to say for everyone else. But I actually believe in a lot of the ideas that you were just supporting. I think that it is a good thing to have a stronger and greener sort of stewardship on the environment than we've seen in the last decades, hundreds of years even, but certainly the last decades. And Europe, at the European level, has been good in that way. It's a problem for me that I've noticed that that's not a particularly democratic thing, right? So it is meaningful to me that what I want, you know, a much more aggressive, and for that matter, very open Europe is not necessarily what my fellow citizens here in the Netherlands want or what fellow Europeans want. And that makes it hard for me to be very full-throated in saying we should be pushing harder and harder on these things. It makes it hard for me personally. But I personally agree with you that it's a very, if we really care about those issues, you really do need a strong Europe at the European level. If you care about you know, a knowledge economy that is populated by people who can actually do the work that we need to have done, that does require at the margin a lot of movement certainly within Europe, and maybe even also outside of the European fold. So I have a lot of these positions that are basically center-lefty positions, but for me it is a really important issue that what the people want matters to me, right? So in the end of all my commitments, I remain a Democrat in the sense of somebody who is sensitive to the idea that some of the things Europe was doing, including a lot of the things that I embrace and think were good, may have overstretched compared to what my fellow citizens want. And that's a problem for me. At least it's something I don't think is easy to solve. So even if I agree with you, I can't say what a disaster if you see that, you know, 35% of people want something really quite different. I mean, that's my own answer. I want to hear what my colleagues say.
Yeah, so this gives me an opportunity to say something about positionality from a different perspective. So we've talked about how this electoral shift will affect policy making in the European Parliament. But I think there's two other areas in which it might also have an effect, and those are the areas that, as a political scientist and therefore a defender of liberal democracy, I am most concerned. So the first one is that a shift towards the populist radical right in the European Parliament will probably mean that the European Parliament will become less effective in safeguarding liberal democracy in member states. So in, putting pressure on countries such as Hungary, and that will be extra problematic if there's more populist radical right parties in power in different member states. The second area is actually the discursive area. So we've very much talked about substantive policy making, but that is not the only thing that goes on in the European Parliament. It's also a discursive arena in which ideas are articulated and therefore become more acceptable in the public sphere, whether it's in the media or for citizens or for mainstream parties. And we've been working on a research project now for 2 years where we've tried to examine just how much illiberal speech populist radical right parties articulate in the European Parliament, with the idea that since Orban really gave his 2014 speech where he really said, illiberalism is a model that can be followed, this idea might have become more prominent in the European Parliament. And our findings are that that is indeed the case. Populist radical right parties promote more illiberal ideas in the European Parliament, significantly more so. And that is something that I find very concerning, because we know from national politics that there is very quickly contagion effects from populist radical right parties' discourse to that of mainstream parties. So that could be a long-term risk for sort of illiberalism becoming more pervasive in Europe, in the European Parliament, but also outside of it. So, I have concerns. I have concerns about liberal democracy because of the rise of these parties.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm a senior process engineer, work in water and wastewater treatment. I don't think actually the question that you asked was answered, which was how do we counter this huge rise in populism? And I'd like to have an answer to that one, but I'll also ask my own, which is if the, let's say, governing political party has allowed systems like education, healthcare, other systems to degrade over time, like they have in the UK, for example, how do we then trust the votes? Because if you don't have an educated population, they can't make an informed democratic decision.
Thank you.
Do you want to take a crack first? Yeah. So, I also want to say that I agree with what Sarah said. So I don't want to make my answer to you sound like I'm running away from the substantive worries about what these parties are doing and what the dangers are, and indeed the threats to liberal democracy are really, really important. So that does raise, indeed, the question is what can be done to address these sets of issues. And to me, part of it is the answer to your second question, which is about education policies and the truth is that people, it's in a lot of countries in the West, including where I come from the US, it's really haunting how little basic civic education people have and a basic understanding they have about what government institutions do, what governments do, what your relationship to each other, how that evolves in the economy and then translates into politics. Really basic things in education go wrong because people are just there's just not attention for any of those kinds of issues. And it has led to an impoverishing of people's sort of civic understanding and a cynicism towards any attempts to try and do something in politics. So to me, one of the things that can be done, it's a very long-term agenda, is really give much more attention to these kinds of issues in education. So for instance, when it comes to liberal democracy, people need to understand what these institutions are, how they work, what the value is of those institutions, what the alternatives would be really like if you run away from them in an Orban illiberal democracy direction. And I believe that that would make a difference in the long run to turn the tide or to defend the liberal democratic order from these attacks. But you're also raising a question when it comes to this education about how much can we trust what people want. I was expressing my trust in democracy, and it is true that part of me, when I see people wanting things that I think are bad, and it's a significant plurality in my midst, I feel humbled by that. But at the same time, I know that there are some issues where if the majority of the country all wants to do something, truly hateful and violent, then I don't say, well, that's the democratic order. That's the way it goes. So there are definitely limits to that, and that's where education becomes really important too. And you can decry that, and you have to make these kinds of choices for yourself. But anyway, so the short answer is that indeed I think there's a lot that can be done. It does involve education. It's not just here and now party political mobilization, getting out and voting, showing up in the European parliamentary election that most people sit out. It's not just that, it's thinking about the long term of civic education. That means a lot to me personally.
So Robin wants to come in as well, but Robert, may I just tag on to that question, that answer you gave, and ask you, so is the presumption that people voting for populist parties are people who have no education? Is that the assumption behind that answer? Because if you offer that education as a recipe to counter populism, then the presumption is that it's the uneducated who vote populist. So could we clarify that?
Can I just shortly say something about that? Well, not necessarily the uneducated, but one could argue that voters for populist parties may be a bit naive about the capacity of politics to change society overnight. They have too many expectations about the power of politics. I still need to answer your question, and the short answer to your question is I published an article a few years ago about the alt-right movement and the idea of a great replacement, and I think it's nonsense. And the whole idea of the article is, the whole point of the article is that I fear that these nonsense are being repeated time and again on the internet, in the alt-right media, and are adopted by politicians and political parties. And this is what I see as a big risk, that it becomes normal to talk about a white genocide. So this is my point, and this brings us to the importance of social media.
I'll go one step back and go to the importance of education first. So, I mean, scholars have been trying to sort of typify populist radical right voters for 30 years now. And historically, it's been the case that education level of all the background characteristics that we know of people has been the most important predictor. Just because, on average, higher educated voters are less likely to support these parties than lower educated voters. But it only accounts for a very small percentage of that vote. It's not an all-explanatory factor. And moreover, as these parties have grown, their electorate has, by definition, become more heterogeneous. If you have between 25% and 30% of the vote in a country, I mean, it means that by definition you have more or less a cross-section of the population. So, you know, it's only a heuristic to say something about these voters. And, you know, it doesn't mean that they are naive or uninformed. Their education level says much more something about their position in society. Because if you dig a little bit deeper and relate those levels of education also to where people live and what their life experiences are, etc., then you find out that they are, on average, more frequently from what is called the places that don't matter, the places where public and private services have eroded. and where citizens have rightfully so concerns about, their quality of life, and where they rightfully feel unrepresented because their issues are less articulated in politics, or they are less represented because parliaments are completely comprised of higher educated representatives. So therefore education is important, but not because it says something about, how informed the vote of these citizens is. It's actually quite informed often in terms that they really see that what they personally believe is the right course for the country is reflected in the program of the populist radical rights. Now, what can we do about this challenge? So civic education is one. Restoring public and private services is another. So objectively, some areas have become more deprived than others in Europe, and that is something that needs to be addressed. And I think the third thing, and that has sort of become a broken record over the past decades, is that mainstream parties have to re-energize ideologically and really articulate ideological conflict. And I think this is particularly important in the context of European Parliament elections, because the differences between the different mainstream groups there, because they always cooperate together, are really unclear for voters. And this has become especially apparent again last week with the Social Democrats voting in favor of the Migration Pact, which from their ideological roots is very difficult to understand.
So I see there is another question in the audience, and I'm going to walk over to the oh, you don't need the mic? You can
I'm retired.
Sorry. Here you go.
I'm retired, and I just have another question for education. I think that the European Parliament would also have the duty to educate the people in Europe about their successes and that type of thing, because the populist parties, who are very nationalistic, they always go back to their national successes. But we never hear from the European Parliament, while they were quite successful, I would say, in climate, but we don't have that for security, we don't have for farming policy. There is still immigration policies are really a big mess. I think they have that duty to show us that we are a bloc and not a bunch of federation countries trying to outdo each other.
I think you're right, and I think this also extends more broadly. I mean, European Parliament politicians are very unknown in the member states. Their role in public debate is relatively small. So I think there's a lot to be done there in terms of sort of democratic ambassadorship from EU politicians and EU institutions to the national arena.
I have another question over here.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'll just stand up. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. And my question, it's going to continue the question on education as one of the drivers of populism. So a lot has been written, of course, on European populism specifically, and academics are quite aware of what are these drivers. In addition to education, so it's, for example, various economic insecurities, or people whose jobs are more exposed to globalization, automation, trade liberalization, and so on and so on. It's also the cultural argument that individuals who perceive that the national culture is being eroded, or they experience some kind of cultural threats, are also more likely to vote for populist parties. But my question is, as we are entering this third wave of populism in Europe, do you expect to see any new cleavage in this? Or in other words, how would you describe a modern populist supporter? Who is this person? Is there anything else that we should look at in this specific new wave of European populism? Thanks.
Thank you.
I think that's a really great question, and you really nicely summarize sort of the dominant perspective in the scholarly literature, that this is sort of, in the broadest sense, an opposition between the winners and losers of globalization, whether that's culturally, economically, or politically. I think we are becoming more aware of other oppositions that also play a role. Well, I already spoke about the places that don't matter, so we're becoming more aware of the role of geography in all of this, and not only the opposition between urban and rural areas, but also between the center and periphery in many European countries, and the fact that people that have a stronger place-based identity also experience stronger place-based resentment towards the center of the country, where the sort of cosmopolitan elites are situated in their perspective, that plays a role. I think another thing that is becoming more important, and this goes for both national elections and also European Parliament elections, is generation. So we see that on average, younger generations are more progressive, cosmopolitan in their attitudes than older generations, and that includes their attitudes towards the EU, which on average are a bit more positive than that of older generations. Part of that has to do with the fact that current generations are more highly educated on average, right? There's just larger numbers of citizens going to forms of higher education across the EU. Especially women, which is also a gender gap that we see as a result, but also because these youngsters have been politically socialized in a period where the EU was a given. The EU as we know it today, with no internal borders, a free market, European currency, etc. So that also has impacted on how they think about the EU. So I think those new kinds of oppositions are important, in addition to or in intersection with gender. I mean, gender has always been a major divide in the support of the populist radical right, with men far more likely to support these parties than women. There's been the idea for a while that might disappear as these parties become more accepted, have female leaders, etc. But we actually now see boys and girls sort of moving apart in their cultural attitudes. So it might actually become stronger now than it used to be, rather than less articulated.
If I may, I want to say two things. So I agree with everything that Sarah highlighted, but there's the two things are sort of extra wrinkles, I guess I would say, to what's changing in drivers to these issues, and where at least I think we have a lot. We're going to see some changes that are going to make it harder to know exactly what the future is for these parties. So one of them is that when it comes to this sort of public services, a big part of what I study when I study populist radical right, populist radical left parties is exactly this socioeconomic side of things, and includes the public services dimension. And indeed, what Sarah mentioned is very important. So a lot of people who feel left behind or ignored or neglected by national politics are also expressing genuine economic suffering that has occurred, and that shows up in, you have to walk further or take a longer bus ride, or if you can find a bus at all, to go to the doctor or to get your groceries done. I mean, these very basic sort of public services are an issue. The problem is that if you look at all the things that have been done to try to address exactly that kind of exclusion, there have been huge amounts of money at every EU country to try to do something about this. So if you look at the fiscal net position across regions within European countries and also between European countries, it's always about the cities trying to provide more fiscal transfers to try to make it easier to do something about this. And I'm myself am really struck by how little progress that has, or little credit they get for those kinds of efforts. It makes me think that a big part of the future has to do with people realizing that this is a structural characteristic that is not the fault of elites, but is a characteristic of people deciding where they can and want to go and work and get jobs. And you can't always blame the elites for, they can't solve rural unemployment and public service problems. I think that's a big part of it. So the other thing I want to say as a wrinkle is that the interesting thing is that a lot of the populist radical right parties are seeing younger people getting more interested in the parties. You saw that in the most recent Dutch election, I think, is maybe an extreme example. But there is a potential shift taking place. And I actually think a lot is going to ride on what happens when more of these parties get power and actually are held accountable by their own polities to do things. We've already seen that in Switzerland for many years. We saw that in Denmark for a number of years. We've seen it for a very long time in Poland and Hungary. So don't kid yourself if you're anti-populist. Don't kid yourself by thinking that once they're in power, everybody will realize that the emperor has no clothes. That's not the way it works. They can find ways of currying favor with a very strong segment of the population. They can do all kinds of things. But we don't know that in a lot of countries where the rise is taking place most dramatically. So a lot depends on what happens with the new Wilders cabinet, for instance. Are people going to think, oh, and young people, and people in rural settings, oh yeah, he really did something for me, and he really created a bus line that didn't exist before, and he's doing something to address my concerns. Anyway, I think that it's conceivable that there is going to be a real shift in these politics because of these dynamics I'm describing. That could end up changing the calculus of who votes for these parties and why they vote for these parties and why not.
Do you also have a question?
First, a comment about education. One of the most frightening and shocking statistics I can think of about the Netherlands is 25% of 15-year-olds are functionally illiterate. And I always have to fact-check that before I even mention it. Sarah de Lange mentioned Denmark and that the populist party sort of imploded because of internal strife. But I was wondering how much of the gain of or the lack of electoral support they had after that was actually due to the Social Democrats changing their position on immigration. And I have a sort of feeling that a lot of especially the populist party, mainstream parties that don't seem to give the importance of immigration as the main topic. If they were a bit more, let's say, Danish Social Democrats, that would take a lot of the steam out of, I was thinking of the winds out of the sails, but steam out of the...
Yeah, so that is a very popular idea also with social democratic leaders across Europe, right? They often refer to the Danish model as one to follow. So it's true that the electoral success of the Danish People's Party in the last election sort of coincided with the collapse of the populist radical right. But if we look at individual voters and their vote switching behavior, then we see that a small group indeed went to the Social Democrats. But that was, for the Social Democrats, compensated by an equally large group of voters with very cosmopolitan, progressive attitudes, moving onwards to Green and other more progressive parties, whereas the largest chunk of the former populist radical right voters either went to mainstream right parties or stayed home. So, I mean, it was a net gain for the left as a whole in Denmark. And that in Denmark, in the Danish context, is very important because it's bloc politics. Either the left governs or the right governs. But it's not a strategy that can easily be translated to a fragmented multi-party system such as the Netherlands or Belgium, for that matter. Because it's not the case there that a little gain here and a loss there will actually mean any structural improvement of your position as a social democratic party in the system. And, you know, it was a very fortunate also coming together of this strategy of the Danish Social Democrats and the collapse of the populist radical right. It's an open question whether it had been equally successful if that party was still thriving. And I think this is also something very important. The biggest losses for these parties across Europe have always been when they have made mistakes, right? When they have had internal scandals, when they have split, because of ideological or leadership conflict. There are very few external factors that really impact on their success. And that also limits a little bit what we can do as a public. It does put the spotlight on the media in terms of, how they cover them and show any kind of disagreement that might exist in these parties. Or, the media can play an important role here by doing serious reporting on what goes on in these parties.
So we have covered a lot of ground, and with Sarah now speaking about what we as individuals can do, and you said maybe not much, and the media should do something. Do the others have any concluding reflections for the audience tonight? What we as human beings, as individuals, can and should do to counter the rise of populism?
Well, I've said my piece, so clearly we have to get more of our kids to read, right? So that 25% statistic, I had not heard that statistic. That is shocking indeed. So to me, it's a long list of things that I'll emphasize my long list. It includes the things that we've been emphasizing about education and civic education, and what parties, mainstream parties, try to bring their own positioning to the public. To me, it has a lot to do with responsiveness to their own voters that needs to be better than it has been in the past. There's a big socioeconomic story that is significant to me. There's a real public relations story. So the earlier question about the EU needing to sort of carry its own water or sell its own accomplishments, I think is very important. People don't know in Spain, for instance, that a very significant chunk of their unemployment insurance check comes from the EU, right? They think it's thank you, Madrid, but it's actually thank you, Brussels and Madrid, right? In fact, even the majority in some of these regions is coming from European social funds right? These kinds of things people should know. When the BBB talks about Europe being problematic and imposing all kinds of rules that are problematic, they should realize that still a huge amount of their own economic sustenance comes from basically the most generous part of the European welfare state, which is the common agricultural policy. So anyway, doing things to try to remind people that the EU is doing these things, I think is really important. And I mean, the only thing that I think that you could add to, that I would want to add to what can be done to make a difference is for people to think about this for themselves and the people around them. Get people to care about this particular election that's coming up, right? So every one of these elections really matters. The common citizens don't realize that elections are really driven by turnout as much as ideological valence within your neighborhood or among your friends. It's getting people to actually show up and vote, and just getting people to be engaged in that very particular, very simple way, I think is the crucial step.
For me personally, I see it as my raison d'être to explain the process of European integration. Today's European Union is like the building of a cathedral. Every 10 years or so something changes in this building, and still there is some sort of an architectural deficit in today's European Union. Some people call this a democratic deficit. European integration was about low politics, for example, and this can partly explain why it's difficult for the European Union to sell its successes. And this is what I teach about, and this is what I feel is my responsibility.
Yeah, I can only emphasize what Brian said. In the short run, the most important thing is to get out the vote. So talk to the people around you about the fact that the elections are coming up. Stimulate them to fill in a vote advice application if they're unsure who to vote for. Talk to them about issues that are at stake at these particular elections. And that will hopefully re-energize the European Union also as a democratic polity, because that is, one of the biggest underlying problems, that there is a deficit in the EU.
Thank you, Sarah. So on that last appeal to more democratic engagement, I would like to thank everybody who was here today, discussed with us. I'd like to to thank the speakers for engaging with all of us, and wishing you a very nice evening.